My name is Deidre Huckabay. I'm 35, and today is Wednesday, June 30th, 2021. I'm in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm having a conversation with Michael Lewanski, who is my partner and collaborator and the curatorial director of the Ear Taxi Festival.
Hi, my name is Michael Lewanski. I'm 42. Today is June 30th, 2021, and I'm here in Chicago, Illinois. I'm interviewing Deidre Huckabay, who is my partner and um, collaborator, and who is, I think, one of the affiliate partners at the Ear Taxi Festival in terms of grant writing.
I think I have been thinking a bit about what to talk about today. Nothing too rigid, but I'm trying to think about what we'd like to know about your experience, Michael, many years after Ear Taxi Festival happens. Um, you know, a sense of what your job has entailed over the last many years, a sense of how it has made you feel, and something about how it has shaped your relationship with being a musician in Chicago. I don't know. That's a lot of questions at the same time, but I guess I want to start with like, how do you feel about this work and what has it looked like so far?
How do I feel about curating your taxi festival? Um, Gosh, mostly tired. Uh, it's been a long process. I mean, I think like for a practical reason, which is that the festival was meant to have taken place in October 2020. But of course, everything had to be postponed uh, till the next year. And I think that meant for the festival leadership that 1 year's worth of work turned into 2 years worth of work. So it's been quite a lot of work, uh, but it's been eye-opening and humbling. I think that's probably the main way that I feel is open-eyed and humbled. There's a lot of there's more great musicians, sound artists, improvisers, experimental musicians, creative musicians, um, contemporary classical musicians. There's more musicians in Chicago doing like really amazing work than is hard than is possible to hold in one's head. And I guess I feel like a lot of responsibility to want to do justice to all of their work. I think that's probably the main emotion that I have. This being sort of June, and the festival happening in 3 months.
It sounds like the microphone moved around a little bit.
Did it?
Yeah.
Maybe I moved.
Okay. Is this better? Is that about the same? Oh, I see. The headphones. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Great. Um, how? Well, so Deidre, like you were at the Air Taxi Festival in 2016, and you wrote about it at the time. I bet that piece of writing is still somewhere to be found. Maybe it's on the does the Cacophony magazine website still exist?
I
Um,
don't. Yeah.
you wrote a piece about it. I wonder if you have any expectations, any reflections on that festival, any expectations for this one. Um,
When I think about the 2021 Ear Taxi Festival and the 2016 version, 20 the first Ear Taxi happened in October 2016, so at the height of what at the time was like really galling, um, and fearsome political environment, and I think it felt like um, we just had to get through the next few weeks. Um, but I don't think it's on. I think it's a bit. It's you know the election was a surprise to a lot of people and changed the way musicians talk about music's role in the world. I think it changed the way artists see themselves in culture. Um, and I think there, in so many, in art and culture, but all over life, like I just think there was a naivete that was possible in 2016 that just isn't possible right now. Um, uh, and so I think the new Ear Taxi Festival really does seem to be struggling with some legacies, with the legacy of classical music and contemporary classical music and new music, these kind of musical genres that are inherited from a Western classical music tradition and which depend for their integrity on the exclusion of non-Western centric kinds of music and artists, non-classical centric music and art. That's all that has all changed quite a lot in the last 5 years. And um, from my experience in the house, seeing your work on the festival, it seems like your Taxi Festival is really trying to deal, negotiate that. And it's, if I had to guess like what culture holds for the next 20 years, I think there's like a real radical slippage in order, a total reorganization of like, your higher capitalized artworks and your other artworks, the excluded artworks. I hope we're in a total, you know, transformational moment. But right now, that transformation is just is like unfolding, right? And I'm excited that Ear Taxi Festival is here to take a snapshot, of like what new music, classical music, music, Chicago music. I don't know, like what's going on in music right now.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that, how hopeful you are. I appreciate that hopeful. I mean, like, and I hope you're right that this is like the beginning of a thing, the very beginning of a thing, maybe a transitional period, an awakening of sorts. I hope you're right. I hope, some if someone comes across this conversation for some reason in 20 years, that they'll be like, oh wow, that was a different time. Um, I certainly hope that's the case, and I really appreciate your optimism. I think I also feel, trying to think about what the festival is going to could or should be, just how contingent this all is. Just how fragile, how you know um, it might happen. This thing might happen. This thing might not happen. This could happen. That could happen. Like how really I feel like the older I've gotten, the more I've understood history to be a thing that might not have happened or something. I think like, and I think to your point about something called classical music's kind of foundationally exclusionary nature. In the last several years, um, for whatever reason, I've been re-reflecting on, say, music history as it was taught to me in schools, and on the one hand, realizing that like that is a very constructed kind of narrative. It's a narrative constructed by certain kinds of people in order to sort of valorize certain kinds of people and exclude other kinds of people. There's that, obviously. There's also the sense in which, like, the history itself, you kind of get, I don't know, when you're in seventh grade and you learn about the Civil War and you learn about the cause of the Civil War, and then you learn this happened, there's that battle, and it all has this very like inevitable feel to it, and I think like just I wish I could communicate to college age me or seventh grade age me, like the extent to which like those things could have not happened, you know. And I think I mean that specifically. I mean, there's all kind of history is like that, but um, I think in terms of musical histories, musical historiography, the the fragileness and contingency of the stuff that has happened is, I think, really particularly like present to me, um, because we're doing a thing that we hope has causes positive changes. That maybe those changes will one day seem inevitable and you know um, but right now seem like contingent and fragile and not at all inevitable.
Yeah. Well, okay, if you were to like what kind what do you want music history curriculum to be in the future?
Yeah, I mean, should there really be one? Like, uh,
Well, I mean history is so important to know.
yeah,
Um
yeah. I mean, like should music history curricula be in the future? I mean, it's like, so I definitely understand the problem that like the specific kind of historiographical, um, I guess, attitude that classical music has. I mean, I understand it because it's like you're just dealing with a lot of stuff, and you got to figure out a way to like tell a story. It's just that like the constructiveness of the story is the thing that's really the problem. Um, I think like I don't have an answer to the question, or like I don't fantasize exactly about what future music history curricula will be, but my sense is that the I feel like I know some of the stuff that we need to do before we can decide what a future music history curriculum is. And that's like, some fundamental decolonization of musics, you know. Um, I mean, maybe that's another thing that I've really been thinking about in the last few years is how colonial musics in the US are, how sort of imposed upon um, music theory, how imposed upon people's um, music theory is, let's say, musical styles are, and how the colonial forces of certain musical traditions um, exclude and, in some cases, try to exterminate other musical traditions. I mean, I think I was telling you about this in the fall that this seems like the clearest example that I can think of that um, in Bolivia there was a group of indigenous people in Bolivia who ended up, I suppose, being sort of quasi enslaved at a monastery, right, by some missionaries, right, and the missionaries essentially taught the indigenous people in Bolivia to um, write essentially 18th century Italian music, which is like just a very, I think, a direct like they literally came and colonized the people and used colonial music styles to make them write music, right? And I think like normally that happens on a much more subtle level, right? But I think we have essentially like um, classical music is a colonial language, right? And it has lots of ways of trying to colonize different other kinds of musics. And I think unpacking that colonization is a first place to start. And I don't know what we find beyond that is like, I don't know. George Lewis calls it maybe a sort of creolization of music. Let's say, but I don't know what the outcome is. I only know that like addressing classical music as a colonial force seems like the urgently necessary thing to me. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, I can picture a future music
Oh,
education
please.
and one in which like literally everyone is musical, and that's amazing, and everyone has the resources they need to practice music from a novice amateur simply curious level to your Lady Gaga level to your um, lang lang level or whatever your example of like ultra virtuosic classical musician is. I just feel like part of decolonizing music to me is decolonizing one's interior relationship to music. I mean, and I think Western classical music. I trained as a flutist, went to conservatory, and you know, since childhood I've been obsessed with like perfection and technique and being the best and um, playing well and uh, to such an extent, the pandemic has been really wonderful for my creative practice because it's really given me a chance to observe the, strength of these critical voices that really were developed in my body and in my experience at the same time as I was just beginning to learn music. I was learning to play the flute and learning that there are 100 ways to play the flute wrong at the same time. And that can't be a music education. We can go ahead and just change that curriculum now. And in my dream utopian society 100 years from now, we've all eradicated those internal oppressors, and everyone has daily musical impulses which they indulge all the time, and there's a festival every day about them. And the world's full of like the vibrations of music for everyone. I experience so much. I think Ear Taxi is working so hard to give context about music to people who may be unfamiliar. To give history, make archives, and of course you can say more about those plans to make archives and stuff, and to commission essays, and to explain music. The pretext being that like music is hard to understand, or like this is difficult music, or like the history of Chicago is difficult to understand, and that is true, but all the time I'm running into audience members who believe themselves to be like listening to music wrong, worried about whether they get it. And again, those are internal colonizers that we gotta eradicate. There's no wrong way to listen to music. Everyone, literally everyone, is musical in some kind of way, just by virtue of like existing on this earth. Life is a vibration,
Yeah, I feel like this feels like the kind of like conversation that you and I often have, where like I don't think we like are disagreeing about anything, but like yours is a very kind of like internal psychological focused kind of way of like sort of self decolonization is like is maybe an angle that you take. And for me, maybe it does feel like more of a political question. Political, not in the sense of like vote for Bernie Sanders and like that, but political in the sense of like how organizations and humans, or how humans organize themselves and relate to each other, and how like capital is involved in that. And so
The
and
my version is in a society where like, giant resource hoarding institutions don't exist anymore. So you don't have to worry about any of the tactics. It just gets exploded and everyone lives on.
well, but you need me thinking about the politics of that to to get there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, maybe a more theoretical question I'm interested in is like the exertion of power through music by institutions and by capital, right? And I think that happens on a number of levels and in a lot of ways. And I think like to your example of you as an undergrad flute player, like having your body disciplined by flute lessons, you know, you as that person who was the flute player is interested in the body being disciplined, and me from whatever position I'm in, especially I'm a conductor, right? I'm a conductor of college students in a college orchestra. I'm the conductor of Ensemble Del Niente. I my role is is as the discipliner, or is thinking about the responsibility of the person that's doing this sort of disciplining of which you speak, and like trying to figure out what um, a, a, a person that by default it is deferred to in various questions of power, and how to use that power responsibly is an extremely complex and difficult question to um, assess. And I'm not a particularly powerful person. I mean, I think large institutions with large budgets, you know, have a lot more power than I do, and like
Well,
for them to be thoughtful about how they distribute their resources um, is a question that I'm interested in addressing, maybe in the shorter and medium term.
I mean, I think by some standards, your Taxi Festival is a well-resourced festival, and your power as its curator is actually quite a lot of power, you know. So what, how did these, how do you think about these questions? How have you been thinking about them for the last couple years as part of your work?
Yeah,
Through
I mean, I think that like I definitely have thought about it partially through the question of genre, because I feel like if you like work in classical music industry, and I do like insist on calling it an industry, like no one likes the term classical music. Like we should call it some. And then if you work in the sort of subgenre called new music, definitely no one likes that term. And it's just like these terms are so litigated, and like and everyone asks what they are all the time, and like I'm like just not interested in answering the question. I'm interested in like asking more questions, and sort of like genre on the one hand is a useful marker. It sort of helps you listen to stuff, but um I'm more interested in like kind of like skirting the question of genre, and like finding, I mean, essentially like the classical music industry to me isn't defined like not so much by what it plays, but by like how it distributes resources and how it causes people to behave, right? It's not like, I mean, this is not my point. This is like this guy Robert Walser and Lauren Kajikawa, these two scholars. That classical music, it's a totally made up tradition, right? It's not like you know 12th century organum composers in Paris have really anything in common with like Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, or and they don't have much in common with like, well, they have something in common with Florence Price. They don't, and like they don't have much in common with like Takamitsu, and like what does Takamitsu have in common with Andili Kumalo, the South African composer? I mean, it's like it's a made up tradition, right? And like it's historically it's a tradition that's made up to exclude people, right? And so I think that like I'm not interested in like you know opening the doors and inviting people into the classical music industry space. I'm more interested in like creating connections between people in different communities, and to the extent that I can, trying to make trying to encourage a world in which resources are more equitably distributed, right?
Mm.
um, I guess like um, I'm not interested in like evangelizing for new music or something like that. I'm not interested in like expanding the reach of new music, or I'm not interested necessarily um, in orchestras expanding their programming, though they should, and I support that, and I do that myself. That's not that's kind of a like that's like a band-aid kind of thing for like sure orchestras should play more black composers. They don't do that. They shouldn't pretend like they don't know where to find them. They're easy to find. There's a lot of music by black composers. Orchestras can and should do that tomorrow. Some of them are doing a better and worse job of that. um, that seems like a very obvious solution. We should all do that tomorrow, right? But it's not like but that still is a kind of seems like a racist and patronizing move to be like, oh, well, no, just like let Black people into the concert hall, right? That's not really the issue. The issue is like the existence of the concert hall, and and trying to, wanting and wanting to encourage like more mutual connection and respect and learning. Um, yeah, and with the understanding that like classical music is, it's in some ways it's undercapitalized, but in a lot of ways it's a very overcapitalized field. It takes a lot of resources, right? Like, I mean, because I mean philanthropy, which of course you can say a lot more about than I can. Um, it, you know, finding, I mean, essentially, like quite simply, like finding classical music industry needs to find a way to redistribute its wealth, and it might even need some sort of like reparative or like reparations kind of discourse in order to get it where it not needs to be. Not that I care about its survival or its demise, just like that's not the yeah, I guess I'm from where I am right now in terms of how I'm thinking about the festival. I'm really much less interested in thinking about classical music or new music as a genre, and much more interested in thinking about it as an industry and a way of distributing capital. I don't know. That's. I'm
Well,
curious to know what your
is-
response is, but that's my like kind of to answer your question. Like, that's what I'm thinking about.
well, yeah, but I also wonder, like, how is Ear Taxi distributing its resources? How is it the distribution of resource different in this ear taxi than in the previous ear taxi? And I mean all resources like money, spaces, personnel resource, technology.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think like we thought a lot about that. I mean, I think like there's a lot of things we want to do with a limited budget, and I think also like what I also want to like really acknowledge and like lead with is that like we made some decisions and we did some things in certain ways, and like I am not gonna like be defensive about those. Like we tried our best with the information we had at the time and the resources that we had, but we definitely like missed some stuff, and we definitely like probably made some other people can like. I hope people will learn from like any mistakes that we make, because we surely made them and will make them. But I think like there are a couple of things we're trying to do in terms of resource distribution. I mean, um, you know, I think so. So maybe a base level thing. And there's of course these concerns always intersect, right? I mean, there's like, me. I'm always talking about bell hooks. Feminist kind of cultural critic has this phrase, the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, right, as a way of describing like how various systems of oppression intersect. And I'm think about that phrase a lot, as you know. So certainly in classical music, um, the discourse of musicians as laborers is a kind of impoverished discourse, in the sense that because everyone likes music, because music is fun, and because I think so. And oftentimes when you go to a concert, you are having fun. Usually, if you're in the audience, if you're going to like an orchestra concert on a Friday night, that's a thing you're doing recreationally, and then you have a great time and you're like, wow, I hope the musicians are having a great time, but you as the viewer don't necessarily have the understanding, the embodied understanding that the musicians in that situation are laboring, right? They're doing like they're workers, right? And also like music seems magical. It is magical. It's a wonderful and mysterious thing. And so it's not a product, it's not a commodity, it's not, if someone makes a bar of soap, it's like you can like, we have some agreed upon ways of evaluating the labor of a person that makes a bar of soap, and then how much the soap is worth, and like then the extractive profit from it. But it's like that doesn't quite work for music. It's hard to really figure out like the relationship between like exchange value, as Marx puts it, is not really clear. So I think therefore musicians are often like readily exploited because it looks like what they're doing is just fun, and it looks like a thing that amateurs like to play music, and they should. I love when amateurs play music, but um, uh, they it's easy to exploit musicians, right? So a thing we tried to do from the beginning was to try to sort of develop a model whereby we could pay the people that were playing and do so in a way that uh, basically respected their labor, but also like didn't overpromise based on our budget, right? So I think that was it. So basically, like an equitable and reasonable pay for every musician. Another thing that was really important to me was to not be heavy-handed about the curation, right? Which to your point about like what we want is a world in which everyone is musical, maybe in which all, um, I want musicians to tell me what they wanted to play, specifically with the idea that we want to represent what's going on in this city in Chicago because that's where we live and that's what we're doing. Um, but I didn't approach it from the point of view of having like I want to make sure this composer gets played and that composer gets played and that composer gets played, and it was more like what do the musicians that are living here and working here want to do, right? So that's certainly like another way that I approached that. Um, then of course, I mean, I think like in terms of connecting communities, certainly like the classical music industry has been uniquely and pointedly and like really conspicuously like oppressive and exclusionary of black creative musicians, right? Who have uh, a long tradition in this city. Um, and when you don't learn that history and that tradition in your college music curricula, right? So, and like frankly, the connections between a lot of the black creative music that is going on in Chicago to this day, which there's a lot. You're white, you're mostly white classical music community is not really in touch with that, right? Isn't aware of the richness of the tradition, isn't aware of like it is impoverished for not for that lack of connection. So specifically, I mean, we wanted to make sure to like uh, by resources. I just mean like we wanted to make sure that like black musicians got paid as well, and also like um, that we could at least like begin or like I don't know, not begin. It's not like our place to begin anything. It's just like uh, another thing that I hope is an outcome of this is that like the history of Chicago music starts getting told, not starts, but like we can be one little place where some of the history of Chicago music gets told, and there will be other places as well, right? And there's some obvious. I mean, there's something like George Lewis's book, of course, on the AACM. But there's a lot more history to be told, right? There's a lot more stories to be told, and I think that's one thing that we really hope is an outcome of the festival is like I don't know, maybe it's a place where a particular kind of story gets told, but that doesn't really answer your question. But those are just all things that I've been thinking about personally.
Do you feel like there's a story from your time at your taxi that is like, you know, historically relevant in the way you're speaking of?
I don't know, man. I don't think. Who cares about my experience? I don't. I think I want to ask you actually, like, what your so. I mean, I'm thinking about this like really as a curator, but you like me are not from Chicago. You're from the South. Um, you know, and you have like a different sort of relationship with Chicago music and art and work than I do. Um, and you're not trying to curate a festival like I am, and you're not trying to spend a certain budget on some things. Um, don't want you to reflect on your taxi necessarily. I do want you to reflect on how Chicago's influenced your musicianship, maybe, or your
Oh,
artistry.
yeah. I mean, I'm from a small town. I think it's also important to just I think maybe a few cities in the US are like this. Um, but I came to Chicago to try to be a new music musician, and I arrived, and the first summer I was in town, I went to all the new music shows I could. Um, and then those led to other things, like friends invited me to theater shows. I invited myself to I knew there was an important theatrical tradition in Chicago, but like hadn't didn't move here for that scene, and come to find out there's a huge and rich tradition here of theater and puppetry and experimental collaborative performance art, um, truly radical performance art tradition here, both in a sort of visual art way and in a theater way, plus, you know, all kinds of music I hadn't thought of as being my thing. Plus so much visual art. I mean, I arrived here thinking I would be one thing, and I wouldn't be what I am now if I hadn't spent time in Chicago absorbing art here. It really encouraged me. I would say the things I've learned about the city are collaboration. Everyone here wants to work together, and by that I also mean like authorship is really distributed across people,
Mhm.
um, which I love. Uh, a lot of different artists work that way, and I find it's also very experimental. It's a bit affordable to live here, so people can afford to make weird, aggressively difficult, not difficult, just like, confrontational, confusing things. Um, yeah, and I love that about Chicago. I don't want to move. I can't imagine a better place to be, like, artistically.
Yeah, the collaboration thing, you know, that's a we haven't talked about that, but that is really like I think such a I don't want to say it's unique about Chicago, but it's just Chicago really leads with with collaboration as an expected spirit in so many places, and that's not necessarily the vibe that classical music always wants to advance.
Oh yeah,
There's a lot of kind of genius ideology, of course, in classical music, and sort of the single author who's an inspired genius or something like that. And I think in Chicago, in a lot of different spaces, in theater and in music and different kinds of musics, um, a collaborative spirit is really is is well practiced, and that's a great thing. I mean, I hope that's another thing that really comes out of. I hope that's another thing that your taxi can. I don't want to say elevate because that implies you're in a position to do the elevating, but like that's a thing that I want people who don't live in Chicago to know about Chicago. Is that
yeah,
there are a lot of different kinds of collaborative practices here, and everyone can people can have their own collaborative practices. Maybe that'll maybe other people will be inspired by that. Cool. Well, I realize like we're almost at the end of our time here.
yeah.
Um, do you have any closing thoughts about, I don't know, not necessarily your taxi, just music in Chicago or anything else?
Yeah, I mostly that this is a very, like, creative place.
Yeah,
That's all.
yeah, right. I mean, I think that's actually like maybe the main thing. I don't, I hope your utopian future emerges. You know, um,
If it's gonna come out anywhere, it's not gonna be New York, it's not gonna be LA. It might be Atlanta or someplace in the South, but it could just
you
as
know,
easily
you know,
be Chicago.
yeah, right. It's Atlanta. I'll be sad to have moved
Yeah.
since that's the city I lived in before Chicago. But yeah, I think like certainly the thing. regardless of like whether the utopian future arrives, the thing that like definitely will be like that people are going to look back at this, you know, back on in this period of like Chicago history is like the remarkable amount of creative energy that is here. That's like really of like great artistic integrity and like just like oozing with talent. You know, it's a remarkable place to live. I mean, I hate the winters, but like I stick it out for like for the art. Anyway, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks.